You've entered Tending the In-Between, a space for those who remember there's more than one layer to reality. I'm Connie Anderson, voice, frequency, and mirror. Here we walk the edges of the seen and unseen, decoding the signals that pulse beneath form. Each transmission is an invitation to remember, to feel what the mind forgot, and to stand inside truth without apology. Breathe. Listen. This is where remembrance begins. There was a moment recently when something should have stopped the world. Information that had been denied, mocked, and buried for years was finally acknowledged in public view. Not as rumor, not as theory, but as documented fact. It wasn't minor. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't harmless. It pointed to systemic abuse, protected violence, and moral collapse at the highest levels of power. And I waited. Not for hysteria, not for spectacle, for recognition, for some visible sign that people were actually grasping what it meant, that children had been harmed, that institutions had protected it, that lies had been maintained for decades, that reality itself had been violated. Instead, nothing happened. Airports stayed full. Coffee lines stayed long. Traffic moved as usual. People kept walking. And that silence was more disturbing than any scandal. Because it wasn't indifference. It was dissociation. The collective nervous system froze. The truth landed, and there was nowhere for it to go. No space to feel it. No structure to hold it. No language to metabolize it. So it was parked, filed away, compartmentalized, buried under routine. I watched people acknowledge it intellectually, and then immediately return to their lives, as if knowing and feeling had been surgically separated. I recognized that pattern. It's what happens when a system has been overwhelmed for too long. When reality becomes too painful, too destabilizing, too implicating to integrate. The psyche doesn't erupt, it shuts down. Part of what people are reacting to, without knowing how to name it, is scale. Not just the facts themselves, the scope. The realization that what's being exposed isn't isolated, isn't accidental, isn't a few bad actors. It points to systems, networks, patterns, decades of manipulation, protection, and distortion. When that becomes visible, something happens in the psyche. The problem stops feeling fixable. It stops feeling containable. It starts to feel total, like the ground beneath everyday life is compromised. Like the rules people thought they were living under were never real. Like consent was manufactured. Like narratives were engineered. Like trust was monetized. That realization is destabilizing. It doesn't produce immediate action. It produces paralysis. Because when something feels that vast, the nervous system asks a brutal question. Where do I go from here? Most people don't have an answer. So the body chooses the only option that feels survivable. It goes still. It keeps going to work. It keeps paying bills. It keeps scrolling. It keeps functioning. Not because everything is fine, because stopping feels impossible. What's being exposed right now isn't just a scandal. It isn't one bad person. It isn't one broken system. It isn't an isolated crime. It points to patterns of abuse, protection, and deception that stretch across institutions, industries, and decades. That realization is heavy, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing that everything is basically working, that safeguards are in place, that someone up there is making sure things don't go too far. You start to understand that much of what we were taught to trust was never designed to protect the vulnerable. It was designed to protect itself. For most people, that recognition is overwhelming. It doesn't feel like information. It feels like the ground giving way. It raises questions with no easy answers. Who can be trusted? What is real? Where is accountability? How long has this been going on? And underneath all of it, what do I do with this? Most people don't have a framework for that. They were never taught how to metabolize moral collapse, how to sit with grief, rage, and disillusionment without shutting down. So the body does what it knows how to do. It freezes. It keeps functioning. It keeps showing up. It keeps performing normalcy. Not because nothing matters, because everything suddenly feels too big to hold. This is the cost of numbness. When shock becomes chronic, conscience dulls. Not out of cruelty, out of self-protection. Empathy retreats. Attention fragments. Moral clarity blurs. People stop asking hard questions. Not because they don't care, because caring feels dangerous. Feeling too much now carries social, emotional, and psychological risk. So people learn to feel less. They learn to skim reality, to scroll past suffering, to normalize what should never be normal, to call survival strength and dissociation resilience. But numbness is not neutral. It reshapes the soul. It shrinks imagination. It weakens courage. It erodes the sense that truth matters. It makes injustice easier to live beside. It makes silence feel safer than integrity. And yet, something else is happening too. Quietly, beneath the noise. Some people are not numbing out. They're not raging either. They're staying present. They're letting themselves feel the weight of what they're seeing. They're refusing to anesthetize their conscience. They're learning how to hold grief without collapsing, anger without becoming cruel, awareness without becoming paranoid. This kind of awakening doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't trend. It doesn't shout. It looks like people choosing to live with clarity in a distorted world, choosing to tell the truth, gently but firmly, choosing to align their lives with what they know is right, choosing to protect the vulnerable where they actually can, choosing to stop outsourcing their moral compass. This is how repair begins, not through spectacle, through coherence, through individuals who refuse to surrender their humanity to overwhelm, through people who decide that numbness is not an option. Maybe the most disturbing thing about this moment is not what has been revealed. It's how quickly we are tempted to adapt to it, to absorb it, to normalize it, to move on. But some things should not be moved on from. Some truths are meant to change us. Some knowledge carries responsibility. If we allow ourselves to feel what this moment actually asks us to feel, sorrow, anger, resolve, compassion, we begin to recover something essential: our moral nervous system, our capacity to care, our willingness to stand in truth without spectacle. That is not weakness. That is strength. And it is the foundation of any real transformation. You've been listening to Tending the In-Between. If this message resonated, you'll find more transmissions, writings, and Earth Pulse updates at tendingtheinbetween.substack.com. Subscribe, listen, and walk with us as we remember what's real. Thank you for being here, for tending the space between illusion and truth.